And then I'll share my screen. Are you guys seeing?
Yeah, nice wallpaper.
What about now?
Yeah, we can see the doc.
Okay. Sweet. Okay, so there's just the one discussion topic that I just added just now. I've got a PR up for the OLM v1 overview doc that I guess I added maybe 2 weeks ago-ish at this point. It's essentially sort of laying out where we are for OLM v1, although we had for the Red Hat maintainers last week, we got together and talked a lot about stuff that's in that document, and we came out with a few potential changes that affect what our plan is going forward. I think primarily, if you go into this, there's also a comment. Let me open it up. But there's a pretty long comment that I haven't had a chance to completely go through yet. I would encourage anyone who's interested in sort of the future of OLM v1 to read through this whole thread. But I think like some of the things that are mentioned in here might actually be addressed by some of the changes we also talked about at our face-to-face. So hopefully there's some alignment there. But my plan this week at least is to sort of do another once over of this whole thread and see where we are on everything. Combine that with what we discussed last week at our face-to-face and try to do an update. So I think my plan at least is to either get this merged and then do another PR to update it based on where we were, or just wait until I can make some changes. So I don't really care one way or the other. So if it merges and someone wants to click the merge button or do the approval, that's fine with me too. But I think my plan is that one way or another, there will be an update that sort of covers sort of the most recent positions that we have on where OLM v1 is going to go. So that's my PSA. I don't know if there's anybody that wants to talk more about that, or if there's any other topics to discuss.
I'm going to jump in here because I don't know if you can see my hand.
No.
Hey, Joe. So I almost hit merge on this one. I guess my feeling is that we ought to merge it and then iterate, because otherwise it's going to be really super noisy trying to discern where the update was versus where the original stance was.
Yeah.
But I kind of like to get a temperature of the room if anybody is concerned about such an outcome.
That is my preference as well. Like it'll just make future changes smaller, more scoped, and simpler, I think. And I think by and large, like a lot of the content there is still what we want. It's just, I think the changes that we'll see are primarily along like, what is our solution going to be and what things are possible given that new solution.
Yeah, a lot of the aspirational aspects I feel are pretty unchanged. It's just some of the details.
Yep.
And Varsha has her hand up as well.
My question was kind of a follow-up. I didn't get a chance to get myself updated with what happened last week at the face-to-face with the OLM maintainers. So I'm curious if there was any discussion specific to the cluster scope, extension API and the namespace scoped extension API, which is going to have KApp controller underneath.
Yep.
Just to get an overall idea of what was discussed and if there was any issue and anything out of it so that I can get up to date on what's happening.
Yeah, I think the big outcome is that we think we want both APIs actually. So we're thinking of making the cluster extension API sort of the primary place that we direct end users for installation of operators. And we would essentially say that like if you're going to use that API, you have to support all namespaces mode. So that way there's essentially some guarantees, at least if you're a registry v1 bundle. That way there's some guarantees around like you are establishing this controller and API as the thing for the entire cluster. And I think that's probably the focus. So like in terms of like the immediate future, like I think the focus is probably around that API. For the extension API, we still want it, and we still want to do essentially what we're doing now. I think with one exception, which is that the consensus seemed to be that in the extension API, rather than try to manage any possible type of workload and application and bundle content, we would limit it to supporting just content that's namespace scoped. So like you wouldn't be able to install an API with the extension API at all because the CRD is a cluster scoped API. So I think those are probably the two biggest outcomes. Generally, the way we arrived there, I think I mean I'd probably have to go back and look at some of the notes we took, but I think the high level aspects there were like if you go look at the hard truths doc, it talks about the global API type system and all of the problems with not understanding the watch scope. And also there are problems that David Eads talked about in terms of having multiple informers for a particular API on the cluster that you lose guarantees around ordering, which can cause essentially can cause consistency assumptions to break down and fail in unexpected ways. And so his advice was you really should lean into having like you're making the recommendation in the hard truths doc that people should do, one controller per cluster. Let's make an API that really rallies around that point. And then for the operator developer teams or the admin teams that can't align that way, like there's still this other namespace scoped API that you can use, but we're also recognizing like there's a lot that's not really something we can provide guarantees around with that. And so like some of the features around discovery or dependency management like just wouldn't be there. So like that API would be more geared towards like, please like give me the primitives around upgrade controls and constant reconciliation for arbitrary namespace scoped resources. And that's sort of about it, right? Whereas like the cluster extension API would give you a lot more of the operator-centric behavior. So I think we need to, I mean, that's sort of like the off the cuff, maybe 3 or 4 minute description of one of the main topics we talked about and got consensus on. But I think we need to, like I said, like maybe write this up and sort of make it a little more specific about what our approach is going to be. But that's sort of the 10,000 foot view, at least.
I'm a bit confused on this approach, especially given we are trying to handle multiple things in the same scope of a particular product. Because the all namespace question, which you mentioned, Joe, that can still be handled if it's a namespace scoped API. And the other thing, I agree that Kubernetes inherently has CRD as cluster scope, so it's difficult to have the whole concept of watch namespaces in the namespace scope side of things. But what's the benefit of having two APIs, one for CRDs and other for just manifest or whatever it's intended to with respect to extension controller? What are we targeting by telling users that we have two scoped APIs, one does this, one does that? Why are we not taking a particular stand and things like that? I don't want to barge in the discussion, and I don't know what happened and how the consensus is taken. So on my part, probably I would have to go and check in everything. But it would be nice if an issue is created and a discussion is made on
Yeah.
GitHub or somewhere a doc is created to get an overview and
Yep,
get
definitely.
question answered in terms of everything what's happening in
Yep.
general.
Yeah, so we just haven't had time to put all that together. I think to address your question and concern, I think the place that we arrived was essentially let's try to align our APIs with where we want user behavior to actually go. And so like the cluster extension API is not just limited to APIs, it's limited, like you can install anything with the cluster extension API. You can install like a registry v1 bundle in all of its contents. So, you know, like the idea I think is like, let's get our community rallying around some of the hard truths that are in the doc about like why multi-tenancy is hard. But let's not completely shut them out of it, right? So like, let's build the APIs that sort of promote and nudge people towards the best practices, which is like a cluster extension that owns an API for an entire control plane. But you know, that's not necessarily like we shouldn't necessarily like I think OLM v0 had this problem of like being too opinionated. So I think like the extension namespace scoped API is sort of the escape hatch for like, well, you're not going to get the same features because they can't be guaranteed at this level. But if you know what you're doing, like you can still do the multi-controller install thing on a cluster, where you install the API once with a cluster extension, and then you install however many controllers you want at the extension layer. So I think we're like, it might be like a little bit more to manage, but I think the beauty is that like the set of things and concerns that we're worried about in the cluster extension API combined with the set of concerns and scope of the namespace scoped extension API, that's not we at least the sort of the hypothesis is like the combined scope of both of those things is really no different than this what we were attempting to scope with just a single API. But now we've hopefully like if we're doing a good job, like we've made each thing a little bit simpler so that like we don't have to try to think about all of the concerns all at once all the time. So I think we need to, like you said, like go and actually write down and figure out like what are the details of how all of this is going to coalesce and work together. But that's where we're thinking right now. And it seemed like, at least in the room, among you know, the engineers, David Eads, product management, it seemed like at least everyone on the Red Hat side was happy with the direction that we ended up sort of arriving at a consensus with.
Yeah, it would be nice to take a look at this because one of the common questions which had come up during KubeCon was regarding this multi-tenancy, and having one controller per cluster is ideal, but unfortunately that's not something which actually happens or is possible in a practical scenario. So it's always preferable, or that's what at least users use architecturally, of having a single API and probably multiple other controllers acting on it. So considering that, I'm just curious on the history of the decision and how we are going to go ahead on actually rallying the whole concept, though it's the Kubernetes best practice. But since this product is for cluster admins and for users, it actually depends on how people are using it rather than how we want it to be following the best practice. So that's just a thought, and it would be nice to have more discussions on it.
Yep, and to be clear, if I wasn't clear before, we're like all of those use cases are still going to be supported, right? Like you'll still be able to create a cluster extension that installs the CRD once, and then create however many extensions that install the controller bits as many times as you want throughout the cluster, right? So like those use cases are still going to be there. I think primarily this is an acknowledgement that like all of the features that we built in OLM v0 around trying to make multi-tenancy a first class feature just didn't work, right? There's just a bunch of bugs and there's a bunch of maintenance hassle and assumptions are broken all the time. And so I think the overriding thought in the meeting was, as long as you're a cluster admin that sort of understands what you're putting on your infrastructure, like by all means, like you can make that work. We won't get in the way of it, but there are certain things like we can't do, right? Like if you want to do dependency resolution, what does that even mean in the context of a cluster? Like if you say like I'm a controller that depends on an API existing, that doesn't really work in the case of an extension API that only reconciles in some namespaces, because like you don't have knowledge of that. So I think like this direction was an acknowledgement that like we can actually build some of those features if we do this at a cluster extension level, and maybe we can focus more on providing more features if we do it at that level than what we thought we could do if we only did it at the extension level. So yeah, I don't think like we're not leaving anybody high and dry with this. This is more of a carrot than a stick, I think.
Yeah, I'm not against the whole concept of having it cluster scoped or using the cluster extension API. I'm just worried and curious if we are making the same mistake of OLM v0 of trying to have two APIs, confusing on how users will use it and trying to make everyone happy, and in turn getting into the same tech debt of what we had in v0, trying to do everything, but in the end ending up having a confused scenario. But like this is just in the design state, so just trying to understand and demarcate what's happening.
Yeah, I think that's a totally valid concern that we'll have to make sure we have a good story for sure. Thanks, Marcia. Any other last minute discussion topics? Can be anything, everything. If not, we'll go ahead and end this thing early and give everybody a big chunk of time back. All right, thanks everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.